The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Inez Rhodes read it 3 times before she allowed herself to understand what it actually said. She was sitting at the small wooden table in her boarding house room in St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1883, with the weak morning light filtering through a curtain that had not been properly white in years. The letter was from a man named Robert Walker, a cattle rancher in Cutter's Creek, Texas, and it had been sent through the Hargrove Matrimonial Agency, which was the agency that had matched them after 6 weeks of careful correspondence, and it said, in plain and unhurried handwriting, that he had reconsidered, that he was sorry for the trouble and the expense, that he hoped she would understand that a man in his position, with a ranch to run and no time for the complications that a wife would inevitably bring, had simply made an error in judgment when he had submitted his name to the agency in the first place. He wished her well. He enclosed a $5 bill which he said might help with the return of her ticket, though he suspected she had not yet departed. He was wrong. She had already purchased her ticket. She had already given up her room at the Whitmore boarding house for a reduced rate through the end of the month, and she had already written to her sister in Cincinnati to say that she would not be returning to Ohio after all, and that she had found a situation that suited her. She had already sold 2 of her 4 dresses, because she had been told by the agency that a rancher's wife in West Texas did not need fine city dresses and would need the money more than the fabric. Inez folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She set it on the table. She looked at the $5 bill, and then she looked at the window, and then she looked at her packed trunk sitting by the door, with her name written on a paper tag tied to its handle in her own neat handwriting. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 4 years working as a seamstress in a small shop on Vine Street that was owned by a man who paid her wages that were just low enough to keep her dependent on the boarding house's reduced rates, and just high enough that she could not reasonably complain. She had no parents living. Her father had died of consumption when she was 17, and her mother had followed him 2 years later, and her sister Alina had married a dry goods merchant in Cincinnati who was a perfectly adequate man, but who had made it quietly and persistently clear that Inez's continued presence in his household was a burden, not a blessing. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men on the street, but she was handsome in a serious and considered way, with dark eyes and thick chestnut hair and hands that were always slightly rough from the work she did, and she was intelligent and capable, and she had thought, when she submitted her own information to the Hargrove Matrimonial Agency, that she was being practical, not romantic. She did not pick the letter back up. She did not unfold it and read it again. She left it on the table with the $5 bill sitting on top of it, and she picked up her trunk, and she went to the station. The train to Texas departed at 9:30 in the morning, and Inez was on it. She was not on it because she was foolish, and she was not on it because she had constructed some fantasy about a man who had already told her plainly that he did not want her. She was on it because she had looked at her life in St. Louis with clear eyes and recognized that returning to it was not something she was willing to do. She was on it because a ticket to Cutter's Creek, Texas, was something she had paid for, and she had very little money to spare, and going somewhere, even somewhere unwelcoming, was better than going nowhere. She was on it because she was a practical woman who had learned early that the world did not rearrange itself to accommodate her preferences, and that the only sensible response to that fact was to move through it anyway, with as much dignity as she could carry. She sat by the window and watched St. Louis give way to open land, and she thought about what she would do when she arrived. She would not beg. She had decided that before the train even cleared the city limits. She would not perform distress or vulnerability in order to make a man feel obligated to keep her. If Robert Walker met her at the station and confirmed what his letter had said, she would thank him for the information, and she would find somewhere to stay in Cutter's Creek, and she would find work, and she would build something from whatever materials were available. She had done it before. What she had not allowed herself to think about not really, was the possibility that he might have changed his mind. The journey from St. Louis to Cutter's Creek took the better part of 2 days, with a transfer in San Antonio and a stretch of track that ran through country so flat and so enormous that it made Inez feel, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely small. The sky in Texas was a different sky than the one she had grown up under. It went further. It had more to say. The land beneath it was dry and tan and broken by clusters of mesquite and the occasional shallow creek bed, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves that bent the grass and lifted the dust, and then set everything back down again, as though it had simply been inspecting things, and found them satisfactory. She arrived in Cutter's Creek at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The station was a small wooden building with a covered platform and a hand-painted sign that said Cutter's Creek Pop, 412. There was a water tower. There were 2 horses tied to the hitching post in front of the general store across the road. There was a woman in a blue dress standing on the platform with a basket, apparently waiting for a package, and there was a man sitting on a bench at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low and his elbows resting on his knees. And something about the posture of that man, something deliberate about the stillness of him, made Inez look at him before she looked at anything else. She stepped down from the train with her trunk, which the porter had set on the platform, and she stood with her hand on its handle, and she looked at the man on the bench. He was tall, even-seated. She could tell that from the length of his legs. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket and denim trousers and boots that had been good quality once, and still had the shape of good quality about them, even if the leather was scuffed beyond repair. His hat was brown and well-shaped, and had a band of dark sweat staining the felt at the base of the crown. He had not moved when she stepped off the train, but he had lifted his head slightly, and she could see his jaw and the line of his mouth, which was pressed together in an expression she could not read at this distance. Inez picked up her trunk and walked toward him. He stood when she was about 10 feet away. He was 31 years old. She knew that from his letters, and he looked it, not in a way that suggested hardship had aged him beyond his years, but in the way that a man who worked outdoors in Texas weather looked his age honestly, with sun lines at the corners of his eyes and a steadiness in his face that younger men did not yet have. His eyes were a pale gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were fixed on her with an expression that was not quite what she had expected, which was embarrassment or cold distance or the braced look of a man preparing to repeat an unpleasant truth. He looked instead like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely certain how it was going to be received. She stopped in front of him. She set her trunk down. "You must be Robert Walker," she said, because it seemed important to say it plainly, to put names to things from the beginning. "I am," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined from his letters. "And you are Inez Rhodes." "I am," she said. "I received your letter." A silence settled between them. The train behind her was still breathing steam. The woman with the basket had found her package and was walking away down the platform. The wind moved through the station and lifted a curl of dust from the boards. "I know you did," he said. "I wrote it. I've been thinking about it since I sent it." He paused. He looked at her trunk and then at her face. "I think I made a mistake." Inez studied him. She was good at reading people. Years of the kind of quiet work she had done, work that put her in rooms where she was mostly invisible, had made her observant in ways that were occasionally useful. He did not look like a man who was saying what he thought she wanted to hear. He looked like a man who was saying something that was costing him something and who was saying it anyway. "The letter was very clear," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It was. And I sent it too late for it to reach you before you left, and I'm sorry for that. I should have sent it sooner, or I should not have sent it at all. I'm not entirely sure which." He paused again. He looked at her with those sage-green eyes and said, without any decoration at all, "I changed my mind, Miss Rhodes. If you're willing to hear why, I'd like to tell you. And then the decision is yours." Inez looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the station around them and the town beyond it and the enormous flat Texas sky above everything, and she picked up her trunk. "All right," she said. "Tell me." He had a buckboard wagon waiting at the hitching post, with a chestnut mare that flicked her ears at Inez when Robert loaded her trunk into the wagon bed. His ranch was 4 miles outside of town, he told her as they drove, and the road to it was not much of a road in the way that she would understand a road, but it was navigable in dry weather, and he had been lucky because it had not rained in 10 days. He told her, as the wagon moved through the flat country, and the mesquite cast thin shadows in the afternoon light, that he had submitted his information to the Hargrove Matrimonial Agency 14 months ago, after a winter that had been the loneliest winter of his life. He told her that his mother had died the previous fall, and that she had been the last family he had, and that the ranch felt very large when there was no one in it but him and his hand, a Mexican man named Dario Vasquez who had worked for Robert's father and who slept in the bunkhouse, and who was a fine worker and a good man, but who was not company in the way that Robert needed. He told her that after his mother's death, the loneliness had gotten large enough to do something about, and so he had written to the agency. He told her that the letters he had exchanged with Inez had been, in all honesty, better than he had expected. That she was clear and direct, and had a dry humor that showed up in odd places, and that he had found himself looking forward to her letters in a way that surprised him. He told her that the letter canceling the arrangement had been written in a different state of mind. He told her that in March he had ridden out to check on the south fence line, and had found 3 of his cattle with screwworm, which was a serious and expensive problem that had eaten into his reserves in a way that made the future look uncertain in a way it had not looked before. He told her that he had sat at his kitchen table that night and thought about what it would mean to bring a woman out here under false pretenses, to a situation that was harder than what he had described, and that the letter had come out of that feeling, not out of indifference to her, but out of something that had looked at the time like consideration. And then, Inez said, she was watching the land ahead of them rather than his face, but she was listening to everything. "And then I kept thinking about it," he said. "For 2 weeks I kept thinking about it. About the fact that you'd already bought a ticket, that you'd given things up to come here, and that the honest answer to whether I wanted a wife was yes, I did, and that the honest answer to whether I wanted the particular wife I'd been writing to for 6 weeks was also yes, and that the reason I'd written that letter was fear, not practicality." He paused. "I'm not a man who likes to admit to being afraid of things, but I think I was afraid of being responsible for someone, of bringing someone out here and having it be hard for them and having it be my fault." Inez turned her head and looked at him then. He was watching the mare's ears. His hands on the reins were still and steady. "It will be hard," she said. "This place is hard, I could see that from the train." "It is," he agreed. "I won't tell you otherwise. But you came to the station anyway." "I came to the station," he said, "because I thought I owed you that much, and because I thought if you came all this way you deserved to hear it from me in person instead of from a letter, and because I wanted to see you." He said that last part quietly without looking at her, and she thought it had cost him something to say it. She looked at the land again. A hawk was turning in slow circles over a distant stand of mesquite. The light was thickening toward late afternoon, and the shadows were longer, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass and something faintly piney that she could not identify. "I'll stay," she said. "On a trial basis, Mr. Walker. I think that's the fair arrangement. You're not the only one who gets to decide how this goes." He looked at her then. For just a moment something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." The Walker Ranch was not what Inez had pictured, which was perhaps because she had been picturing it with the context of his letter in mind, the letter that spoke of cancellation and difficulty. What she found instead was a place that was worn and working, and had clearly been well loved at some point in its history. The main house was a low structure of adobe and rough timber, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen garden in the back that had been planted and then somewhat neglected, with weeds growing through the rows of what had once been, she thought, beans and onions. There was a proper barn that was in good repair, and a bunkhouse, and a chicken yard, and several dozen head of cattle in a pasture that backed up against a dry creek bed lined with cottonwood trees, whose leaves were just beginning to come in green. Dario Vasquez was in the barn when they arrived, and he came out to help with the trunk, and he said, "Welcome, Miss Rhodes," with a formality that contained genuine warmth, and she liked him immediately. He was a compact man of perhaps 45, with a weathered face and dark eyes and a mustache that he kept neat, and he had worked this land for nearly 20 years and knew its rhythms in the way that only long residence teaches. Robert showed her the house. He showed her the main room with its stone fireplace and the wooden table his father had built, and the 2 chairs that faced it, and the kitchen with its cast iron stove, and the shelves of provisions that were adequate but not abundant, and the bedroom that had been his mother's, and that he had made up for her with clean linens and a pieced quilt that had belonged to his grandmother. He showed her all of this with the air of a man presenting evidence, offering the facts of his life, and leaving it to her to judge them. She stood in the bedroom with the quilt under her hand and looked out the window at the cottonwood trees along the creek bed and the enormous sky above them, and she felt, without being able to fully explain it, that she was standing in a place where something real could happen. "Thank you," she said. "This is adequate." "High praise," he said, and that time it was actually a smile, small and quick, and it changed his face entirely. The first weeks were careful. They were 2 people learning the language of shared space, which was not always the same language, and was sometimes not a language at all, but a sequence of small negotiations conducted through gestures and silences and the logistics of daily life. Inez was up before Robert most mornings and had coffee on the stove by the time he came in from checking the horses, and he always paused in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he came fully inside, as though adjusting to the fact of her, and she understood that this was not unwelcome adjustment, but simply the process of accommodation that 2 people undertook when they were deciding whether to trust each other. She tackled the kitchen garden on her 3rd day, pulling weeds until her palms blistered and her back ached, and she planted new rows of beans and carrots, and a short row of herbs she found at the general store in town, and Robert watched her do this from the fence and did not comment, which she interpreted correctly as approval. She learned the stove, which was a temperamental instrument with a hot side and a cool side, and a tendency to burn the bottom of things if you did not rotate the pan. She made biscuits that were flat the first time and acceptable the second time and genuinely good the 3rd time, and Robert ate all of them without comment except to say, on the 3rd morning, "These are good biscuits," in the same tone he might have used to confirm the weather, matter of fact and not decorated. She went with him to town the 2nd week. Cutter's Creek was a small and ordinary frontier town, with a main street of dirt and a row of wooden buildings that included the general store, which was run by a man named Harold Petty and his wife Constance, who was the most relentlessly social woman Inez had encountered in some time, and who managed to ask 11 questions in the first 3 minutes of their introduction. There was a saloon called the Broken Spur, which Inez observed from the outside only. There was a livery stable and a doctor's office and a barber shop, and a small white church with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings with the regularity of a clock. There was a land office and a sheriff's office, the latter occupied by a man named Sheriff Dale Prout, who nodded at Robert and then nodded at Inez and said, "So the agency came through after all," which told her that the whole town had been aware of the original arrangement. She met Margaret Hollies, who ran the dressmaker's shop, which was only 2 rooms but which was exactly what Inez had expected a dressmaker's shop in a town this size to be, and she stood in it for several minutes while Margaret told her about the town, and she noticed Margaret's workbench and the quality of the stitching on the half-finished dress that was pinned to the dressmaker's form, and she said, "I was a seamstress in St. Louis." And Margaret looked at her with the particular interest of a person who has been managing alone and now sees a potential ally, and said, "Were you?" That conversation would matter later. Everything in Inez's life had a way of mattering later, which was something she had noticed but not yet articulated to herself. The evenings were the hardest part of the trial period and the most important part. In the evenings, when the work was done and the supper dishes were washed and the lamp was lit on the table, there was nothing to do but be present with each other, and presence required more courage than weeding a garden. Robert was not a talkative man by nature. Inez was not a talkative woman by nature. This might have resulted in long silences that were merely uncomfortable, but it turned out instead to produce a different quality of conversation, where words were chosen carefully because they were not deployed extravagantly, and where what was said had been considered first. She asked him questions about the ranch and about Texas and about his parents, and he answered them with the thoroughness of a man who did not speak often but who meant what he said. And she told him about St. Louis and the seamstress shop and her sister Eleanor and her father who had loved to read, and who had left her his small collection of books, 3 of which she had brought with her in the trunk. On the 8th evening she brought the books out and set them on the table. He picked up the one on top, which was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and turned it over in his hands with a respect that she recognized, and said, "I haven't read this one." "Would you like to?" she said. He looked at her. "You'd lend it to me." "I'd read it to you," she said. "If you wanted, it's better read aloud." He was quiet for a moment, and she was aware that something was being decided, though she could not have said exactly what. Then he said, "All right," and settled back in his chair in the way that a man settles when he intends to stay. She read to him for an hour and a half that night, while the lamp burned and the coyotes called to each other out in the dark somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, and when she stopped he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "He's right about self-reliance, but he doesn't account for how it wears a person out." And Inez, who had thought something similar every time she read that essay, looked at him with something that was not yet what she would have called feeling but was the precursor to it, and said, "No. He doesn't." After that, reading in the evenings became a habit. Sometimes she read and he listened. Sometimes he would take the book from her and read a passage back to her, and his reading voice was different from his speaking voice, more careful, as though he was giving each word its full weight. They read Emerson, and they read a novel she had brought, a battered copy of Jane Eyre that had been her mother's, and Robert tolerated Mr. Rochester with a skepticism that Inez found entirely justified, and they debated this with a seriousness that neither of them acknowledged was a form of pleasure. The cattle situation remained a concern. The screwworm outbreak that Robert had described in the wagon had been addressed, but had cost him a significant portion of his spring reserves, and there were decisions to be made about the fall drive that had consequences he was working through. He talked to her about it one evening, not asking for solutions but simply thinking aloud, and she listened carefully and asked questions, and she said, "What would happen if you pushed the drive to the Abilene market instead of San Antonio?" He looked at her. "Abilene is further, but the prices are higher," she said. "Dario told me. He mentioned it when we were fixing the fence line yesterday." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You were fixing the fence line yesterday." "It needed doing," she said. "Dario showed me which posts needed setting. I was useful." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of being moved, which was very quiet and very still. "You were out setting fence posts." "I was," she said, "and I learned that Abilene is paying better than San Antonio this season, and that Dario thinks the drive is worth the extra days." Robert folded his hands on the table. "He's probably right," he said. He paused. "He usually is. So I'll think about Abilene." He went to Abilene in September, but that was still months away. The trial period ended in a way that neither of them formally declared, which was appropriate because formal declarations were not the mode of either of their characters. What happened was that somewhere in the 6th week, the quality of the space between them changed. It was not a dramatic change. It did not announce itself. It was more like the way a room changes when the season turns and the light comes in at a different angle. And you notice one day that things look different and realize they have been looking different for some time, and you simply had not stopped to name it. He had been calling her Miss Rhodes since the station, which was correct and appropriate. And one morning in the 6th week he came in for coffee and said, Inez, just her name, because he wanted to tell her that one of the chickens had gotten out, and she handed him his coffee and said, Robert, just his name, as a test of how it sat in her mouth, and it sat there easily like a word she had been saying all her life. After that, they used each other's names, and the distance that had been in the air between them shifted by a degree. There was a community gathering at the church in May, which Constance Petty organized with the formidable energy that she brought to all social events, and Inez went with Robert, and she wore her best dress, which was the green one with the small white buttons that she had kept when she sold the others, and she was aware of the town assessing her, and decided that the assessment was reasonable and did not require her to perform anything other than herself. She talked to Margaret Hollies for a long time about dressmaking and about the fabrics that came in on the supply wagons from San Antonio. She talked to a woman named Clara Drummond, whose husband ran the livery stable, about the kitchen garden. She listened to Robert talk to a rancher named Pete Alcott about the cattle market, and she noticed the way Pete looked at her, a quick sideways assessing look, and then said to Robert, "Your wife seems capable," and Robert said, without any hesitation at all, "She is." She was not yet his wife. They were not yet married. But the word had been used, and neither of them corrected it, and walking back to the wagon afterward, Robert said, "I should have introduced you properly. I should have said you were my intended." "I'm not sure I'm your intended," Inez said. "We haven't discussed it." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were in the dark of the side street, with the church light behind them and the sound of other people's conversations fading as they dispersed to their wagons, and the stars above them were the most extraordinary thing she had seen in Texas so far, which was saying something, because Texas had shown her several extraordinary things. "I'd like to discuss it," he said. He was looking at her with the particular stillness that she had come to understand was how he looked when something mattered to him. "If you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had sat in a boarding house room in St. Louis with a $5 bill on a table and a trunk by the door and a decision to make. She thought about the train and the 2 days of traveling and the way the sky had changed as she moved south and west. She thought about biscuits and fence posts and Emerson and the sound of his voice reading from her mother's book. "I'm willing," she said. "Then I'm asking," he said. "I'm not asking the way the agency asked, on paper through a third party. I'm asking you directly. Inez Rhodes, would you marry me?" It was not entirely a question. It had the weight of a statement that had been building for weeks, and she heard it both ways simultaneously, as an inquiry and as a declaration, and she stood in the dark Texas night under those enormous stars and felt, for the first time since she could remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Yes," she said. "Robert Walker, I will marry you." He reached out and took her hand, and it was the first time he had touched her except to hand her down from the wagon and help her with her trunk on the first day. And his hand was large and warm and calloused and steady, and she left her hand in it as they walked back to the wagon, and she did not think about St. Louis once. They were married at the white church with the bell on a Saturday morning in June. It was a small ceremony because they had not been in Cutter's Creek long enough to have the kind of extended community that produces large weddings, but the people who were there were the people who mattered. Dario Vasquez was there, and sat in the front pew with his hat in his hands, and a dignity about him that made Inez feel the ceremony was being properly witnessed. Constance and Harold Petty were there, Constance weeping happily before the ceremony had even properly begun. Margaret Hollies was there, having made small adjustments to Inez's green dress that transformed it into something that was genuinely wedding-worthy, which was the kind of magic that a good seamstress could perform on short notice. Clara Drummond was there with her husband Tom. Pete Alcott was there, and shook Robert's hand afterward with the same assessment in his eyes that had been there before, but now accompanied by something like approval. The Reverend James Whitfield performed the ceremony. He was a small, serious man with white hair who delivered the words of the ceremony with neither excess nor deficit. And when he said, "Do you, Robert Walker, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife?" Robert looked at Inez with those sage-green eyes and said, "I do," with a conviction that was not performed but simply present, like the man himself. And when Reverend Whitfield said, "Do you, Inez Rhodes, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" she looked at Robert and said, "I do," and meant it with every practical, clear-eyed, unromanticized cell of her body, which was, she thought, a more profound form of meaning it than any other kind. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the church hall, with food that people had brought, which was the custom in small frontier communities where celebration was communal property. There was cake and there were pies, and there was lemonade, and there was, somewhat to Inez's amusement, a fiddle player named Old Cass Whitmore who was not old at all, but who went by the name because his father had been Cass before him, and who played reels and waltzes with equal enthusiasm. Robert danced badly and knew it. Inez danced adequately. They managed one waltz together that was more coordinated than it had any right to be, given Robert's frank acknowledgment as he extended his hand to her that he had not danced since his mother's birthday 3 years prior. "You're stepping on my feet," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Stop looking at your feet and look at me," she said. He looked at her, and they stopped being quite so awkward, and the waltz resolved itself into something that was not graceful but was genuine. And when it ended and they separated to return to the company of the other guests, Constance Petty pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and said, "Beautiful," with a feeling that was out of proportion to the dance, but that Inez found she did not mind at all. The summer was the summer of becoming. It was the summer during which Inez learned what it meant to live in this land and in this marriage, and the two were not separable. The heat of a Texas July was not a thing she had been fully prepared for, coming from Missouri, where summer was warm but did not have this quality of insistence, this dry and total commitment to being hot that the Texas heat maintained from sunup past sundown and sometimes well into the night. She learned to move more slowly in the afternoon. She learned to keep water close. She learned that the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek was a resource to be used strategically. She also began working 2 days a week with Margaret Hollies at the dressmaker's shop, having proposed the arrangement with a directness that Margaret appreciated, and it brought in a small but meaningful income that was Inez's own, and she used some of it to buy books from the supply wagon, and Robert saw the new books on the table one evening and looked at them without saying anything, but she saw the corner of his mouth move upward slightly, which was the Robert Walker equivalent of a warm reception. She was learning him in the way that you learn a landscape, not all at once but by degrees, by walking the same ground in different light and different weather, until the features of it became familiar and then became beloved. She learned that he woke before dawn not because he needed to, but because he liked the hour before first light, the particular quality of darkness before the birds started. She learned that he had a temper that was slow to arrive, but that arrived fully when something genuinely warranted it, which it had done once in the summer, when a neighbor named Hurst had moved some cattle across the southwest corner of the Walker property without asking, and Robert had ridden out to speak to him, and she had seen his face when he came back, which was still and controlled, but had the white line around the jaw that she had come to associate with genuine anger. And she had given him space and then asked later what had happened, and he had told her flatly, and she had said, "Do you want me to write a letter to Hurst?" And the white line had disappeared, and he had said, "What kind of letter?" And she had said, "A formal, legal-sounding letter that outlines the property boundary with precision and recommends that he be more attentive to it in future." And he had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Yes, that's exactly what I want." She wrote the letter. She had a good formal hand and a clear way with language that owed something to the father who had loved to read, and the letter was, by any measure, an excellent letter, cool and specific and entirely unanswerable. Hurst did not move cattle across that corner of the Walker property again. She was learning also that Robert had a particular way with animals that was quiet and that she admired. He did not force horses. He spoke to them in a low voice and waited for them to decide, and they always decided his way eventually, because there was something in his stillness that animals trusted in the way that Inez had come to trust it herself. He had a dog, a red cattle dog named Scout, who had been with him for 7 years and who regarded Inez with initial suspicion that lasted exactly 1 week, at the end of which Scout began sleeping on the porch outside the bedroom window, which Robert told her was the highest honor the dog was capable of bestowing. She liked Scout. She had not expected to. She had not had dogs growing up and had been vaguely uncertain about them, but Scout's company was uncomplicated in a way that was restful, and she found herself talking to him in the garden, which she had never done with any living creature before, and which she would have denied if anyone had asked. In August, a difficulty arrived that was not about cattle or property lines, but was of a different and more personal kind. A letter came from Alina, her sister in Cincinnati. Alina wrote twice a year reliably, with an exactness about the schedule that suggested it was a duty. She intended to perform, and did perform, and felt properly discharged by performing. This letter was different from the usual ones. This letter said that Alina's husband had lost a significant portion of his business to a fire in March, and that they were in difficult circumstances, and that Alina had been thinking about what might be done, and had wondered whether Inez might be in a position to help with a loan, as Alina put it, of some substance. Inez read the letter twice and then put it down and sat with it. She and Robert were not wealthy. They were not even comfortably prosperous in the way that some ranchers in the territory were. They were working and managing and building towards something, and the screwworm outbreak had taken a real bite out of the reserves, and the decision about the Abilene Drive was still pending. But Alina was her sister, the only family she had. She brought it to Robert that evening, not as a request but as an information sharing, laying the letter on the table between them and explaining the situation. He read the letter and set it down and looked at the fire for a while. "How much is she asking for?" he said. "She doesn't say exactly. She says some substance, which I think is about $50. Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing right now." "I know," Inez said. "I'm not asking you to give it. I wanted you to know about it. It's my family situation and I thought you should be aware of it." He looked at her. "It's our family situation," he said, with an emphasis on the hour that was quiet but unmistakable. "She's your sister, which means she's in my family now too." He paused. "Can we manage $30 without touching the drive reserves?" Inez thought about it. She thought about the accounts she had been keeping in the small ledger she had started in July, with Robert's blessing, and then his genuine relief, because he was a better rancher than he was an accountant, and the ledger had clarified several things that had been vague before. "Yes," she said, "with the money from the dressmaking we can manage 30. Then write to Alina and tell her we're sending 30, he said. "And tell her it's a loan but don't expect it back, because that way you won't be disappointed, and if it does come back it will be a pleasant surprise." Inez looked at him. She looked at him with the same clear-eyed assessment that she had been using since the station, the assessment that she trusted precisely because she did not soften things with it, and she saw him as he was, a man who was not easy or demonstrative or inclined to sentiment, but who was good in the deep-rooted way that good in a person actually means, which is not about charm or generosity of spirit in the public sense, but about how you behave when it costs you something. "Thank you," she said. He looked back at the fire. "We're married," he said, as though that explained everything, and in a way it did. The letter went to Alina with $30. Alina wrote back 6 weeks later to thank them, and the thanks were genuine. Inez could hear Alina's real voice in them for the first time in years, and she felt something ease between herself and her sister that had been knotted for a long time. Robert made the decision about the drive in late August, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of them, and the maps he had from his father spread across the rest of the surface, and Dario standing by the door with his arms folded and his expression attentive. "Abilene," Robert said finally. Dario nodded. "Better prices, it is the right call. It's a longer drive, 3 weeks more than San Antonio." Robert looked at Inez. "I'll be gone most of September into early October." This was the part she had been turning over in her mind since August, since she had first realized the drive was coming, and that it would take him away from the ranch for an extended period. She was not afraid to be alone. She had been alone before and knew she could manage it. But she was aware that this would be a different kind of test, a test of what the ranch was when she was managing it on her own, with only Dario coming and going, and a test of what their marriage was when the daily proximity of it was removed. "I'll manage the ranch," she said. "Dario and I will manage it." Dario said, "See, we will manage fine, Mr. Walker." Robert looked between them. He looked like a man who wanted to argue and could not find the grounds. "There are things you don't know yet about the place," he said. "Then spend the next 2 weeks teaching me," Inez said. He spent the next 2 weeks teaching her. He taught her about the water situation, which was the most critical thing on a dry Texas ranch, and about the state of the south fence line that she had already helped to fix, but that had additional weak spots, and about the horses' particular habits and preferences, and the one mare who would not eat from the left side of the trough, for reasons that no one had ever determined. He taught her how to read the weather signs that were specific to this part of Texas, and that differed from what she had known in Missouri. He taught her where the rifle was kept and how to use it, which she already knew in principle but had not practiced, and they went out to the back of the property, and she shot at a fence post 6 times and hit it 4 times, which he said was adequate and she said was not good enough, and they went back the next day and she hit it 6 times, and he said, "There you go," with that small quiet approval that she had come to understand was his loudest form of praise. He left on the 1st of September with Dario and a hired hand named Charlie Briggs, who was young and earnest, and who tipped his hat to Inez with a solemnity that suggested he understood the gravity of the responsibility being left behind. Robert loaded the horses and the supplies and checked everything twice, and then he stood by the wagon and looked at Inez, who was standing on the porch with her arms folded, and he looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be back before the first frost," he said. "I know you will," she said. He crossed to her. He took both her hands in his, which was unusual enough that she felt the significance of the gesture, and he looked at her face as though he was memorizing it, and then he said, "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in a long time, Inez Walker." She had not heard him use her married name before. She had not really thought about it. It arrived now and settled into her with a warmth she had not entirely anticipated. "Go sell your cattle," she said. "Come home." He kissed her, which was not the first time but which always retained a quality of intention that she appreciated. And then he went, and she stood on the porch and watched the wagon go small in the distance and then disappear in the dust of the road, and Scout sat beside her leg and leaned against her knee, and she put her hand on his head and stood there until there was nothing left to watch. The weeks of his absence were full. She had made sure they would be full, understanding herself well enough to know that empty time was not restful for her, but simply a different kind of difficulty. She worked the ranch with Dario, who was a reliable and capable man, and who taught her things about cattle and land management that Robert had not had time to teach her, with a patience and a thoroughness that she suspected Robert did not know his foreman possessed. She worked at Margaret's shop on her regular days. She wrote letters, one to Robert in care of the cattle agent in Abilene, knowing it might not reach him but wanting to send it anyway, and one to a leaner, and one to a woman she had known in St. Louis, Marta Greenfield, who had been the closest thing to a friend that the boarding house years had produced. In the 3rd week of Robert's absence, A problem arose that was more than she had been prepared for, though she would not have admitted being unprepared while she was in the middle of managing it. A dry storm came out of the southwest on a Wednesday night, which was unusual because September storms in this part of Texas typically carried rain, but this one carried only wind and lightning, and one of the lightning strikes caught a patch of dry grass near the south boundary and started a fire. Dario saw it first, coming out of the bunkhouse at 2 in the morning when the smell reached him, and he woke Inez and they rode out together with wet sacking and every bucket they could carry, and they fought that fire for 4 hours in the dark with the wind against them and the grass burning in long orange lines that moved faster than seemed fair. The fire was stopped before it reached the barn. It did not reach the cattle pasture. It burned perhaps 3 acres of dry grass and a stretch of the south fence line that would need rebuilding, but it did not take the things that could not be replaced, and when the sun came up and the smoke lay across the land in a low gray blanket, Inez and Dario stood at the edge of the burned ground and looked at what they had stopped, and Dario said, "You did well, Mrs. Walker," and she said, "We did well, Dario," and meant both things simultaneously. She did not write to Robert about the fire immediately. She wrote to him after the fence line was rebuilt and the burned ground had been assessed and the situation fully resolved, so that her letter could say what happened and then say what she had done about it, rather than simply being a call for help that he could not have answered from 400 miles away. She thought he would understand this choice. She thought he would see it for what it was, which was not withholding but composure. She was right. He wrote back from Abilene in a letter that arrived on the 22nd of September, and he said that he had read her account of the fire 3 times, and that the thing he felt most was pride, a word he had probably not written in a letter since school, but that it was the exact right word and he was using it. He came home on the 8th of October, 3 days before the first frost. The evening Robert came home was the evening Inez understood fully, in the way that understanding comes sometimes only at the end of a process rather than the beginning of one, what their life was and what it meant to her. He came in at dusk, dusty from the road and leaner than when he had left, with the satisfied and exhausted look of a man who has completed a thing successfully, and he stopped in the doorway of the main room where she had the lamp lit and the supper on the stove, and he looked at her for a moment with those sage-green eyes, and then he crossed the room and held her, fully and without reservation, which was not something he had done before, and she let herself be held and held him back. And there was no awkwardness in it at all. "The prices were good," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "Dario told me you wrote him." "I wrote you too." "You wrote me," she agreed. "You wrote me that you were proud of me." He pulled back slightly to look at her. "I was," he said. "I am." He paused. "The fire, you handled it." "We handled it," she said. "Dario and I should have been here." "You couldn't have been," she said. "And it was handled without you." "That's not a criticism, Robert, that's just the truth." She looked at him. "We are going to have a life here where things happen when you're not here, and I am going to handle them, and that is part of how this works." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I know it is. I think I've always known it about you. That's part of why I came to the station." She thought about that, and then she said, "Tell me about the drive, tell me everything." And he did. He told her about the drive over supper and afterward, sitting by the fire with Scout at their feet, and the first hint of autumn in the night air coming through the window. And she listened and asked questions, and he answered them. And the evening went long and easy in the way that evenings between 2 people who have been apart for a significant time can go, when the reunion is real and the missing has been real, and the return is therefore proportionally satisfying. The fall came to Cutter's Creek with the slow accumulating richness of a season that knows its own worth. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the mornings were cold enough for breath to show, and the kitchen stove that had seemed a trial in the summer heat became, in October, an absolute necessity and also a comfort of the first order. Inez extended the kitchen garden, putting in a row of winter squash that she had seen in the Peterson seed catalog, and she started doing 3 days a week at Margaret's shop instead of 2, because Margaret had had inquiries about curtains from 4 different households and could not manage the work alone. The money from the dressmaking was now a meaningful contribution to the ranch's finances, and Robert acknowledged this not by making a formal statement about it, but by adding a line for it to the household ledger with the same matter-of-fact precision he applied to cattle and feed costs. And she saw this entry one morning when she was reviewing the accounts and understood it as the quiet form of respect it was. In November, Inez realized that she was expecting a child. She was not entirely certain at first, because her experience of such things was limited to what her mother had told her and what the women at the dressmaker's shop had mentioned. But by the 3rd week of November, she was sufficiently certain that she told Robert one evening after supper without preamble, in the way that she handled most important things. "I think we're going to have a child," she said. "In June, probably." Robert was quiet for so long that she began to form a response to silence, but before she had fully assembled it, he stood up from his chair and crossed to where she was sitting and knelt down in front of her, which was not something she had seen him do before, and he took her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that she had no category for because she had not seen it on his face before, which was a kind of open, unguarded joy that he had not previously allowed himself in front of her. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Robert, you don't have to kneel." "I know I don't have to," he said. He stayed where he was. "June." "June," she confirmed. "That's 8 months. 7, roughly. I'm not certain of the exact count." He squeezed her hands. He looked at her with that open face and said, "I didn't think about this. I mean, I knew it was possible, but I didn't think about it as a real thing. Not like this. Is it all right?" She said, and she was aware that this was one of the few times she had asked him a direct question about his feelings on something, because they had established a dynamic in which feelings were shown rather than asked about. But this felt like something she needed to hear clearly. "All right," he repeated. He shook his head slightly. "Inez, it is the best thing you have told me." She looked at him. She felt the warmth of his hands around hers and the firelight in the room and the sound of the wind outside and Scout shifting his weight at their feet. And she thought, not for the first time but more fully than she had before, that this was a life she would choose again. That if she were sitting in a boarding house room in St. Louis with a $5 bill on the table and a trunk by the door and a canceled ticket in front of her, she would make the same choice. She would get on the train. She told him that approximately. "I'm glad you came," he said, still kneeling. "I was afraid when I wrote that letter. I want you to know that. I was afraid and I was wrong and you came anyway and I want you to know what that meant. I told you at the station," she said. "I came because it made more sense to come than to stay. It was practical." "It wasn't just practical," he said. "No," she admitted. "Not entirely." He stood and he drew her to her feet, and he held her the way he had held her the night he came back from the drive, which was the way that said all the things he did not routinely say aloud, and she held him back, and that was enough. The winter was domestic and rich. Inez spent it knitting small garments from wool she ordered from the general store, and Robert, who had never shown an interest in carpentry beyond necessity, began building a cradle in the evenings, working in the main room by the lamp with a focused attention that she found endearing beyond any reasonable proportion. The cradle was not elaborate, but it was solid, and it was clearly built with love, which was better than elaborate. Margaret Hollis taught her to make larger, more careful stitches as the winter progressed and her shape changed, and they had long conversations at the dressmaker's shop about birth and about children, and about the experience of women in the territory, which was a subject that Margaret had strong views on, and which Inez found herself having increasingly strong views on as well. Margaret's strong views were rooted in experience and observation, and in a clear-eyed awareness that life for women in this part of Texas was limited in ways that were not natural limitations but imposed ones, and that the imposed ones deserved to be questioned. Inez agreed with this assessment, and they questioned them together over their needles and thread, and found the questioning valuable even where the answers were not yet available. Robert, told about these conversations in their evening readings and discussions, listened with what Inez had come to recognize as genuine attention rather than polite tolerance, and said, "Margaret Hollies is probably the most capable person in this town, and she runs a shop because there's nothing else available to her." Which was not precisely a revolutionary statement, but which came from him without any suggestion that this was a satisfactory state of affairs, and she appreciated the honesty of it. Constance Petty organized a baby shower in February, which was a small and sweet gathering of women who brought pieced blankets and crocheted booties and small clothing, and who ate cake and told stories about their own children with a warmth and generosity that moved Inez more than she had expected, because she had not anticipated having community here in the way she was finding she did, and the discovery of it kept surprising her, the way a gift keeps surprising you even when you begin to expect it. Spring came back. The kitchen garden that Inez planted in her second April in Cutter's Creek was twice the size of the previous year's garden, and was planned with a precision that Dario admired, and that Robert photographed in his memory in the way he had photographed her account of the fire, which was to say with pride and the desire to tell people about it. She was heavier now and moved more slowly but refused to be otherwise limited, and Robert had learned in 7 months of marriage that suggesting she should slow down for any reason produced a look from her that was considerably more efficient than argument, so he had stopped suggesting it. He did carry things for her when she was not looking, which she noticed and chose not to address. In the last week of May, she noticed that the cattle in the north pasture were showing signs of something that concerned her. She had learned enough about cattle in a year on this ranch to recognize when an animal looked wrong, and 2 of the cows looked wrong in a way that was specific and worried her. She told Robert over breakfast, and he went out and looked and came back and said, with a controlled expression, that she was right and that he needed to ride to town for the doctor, who also served as the veterinarian, as was common in small frontier towns where the luxury of separate practitioners for animals and humans was not available. Doc Hendricks, a stout man with wire spectacles and a brusque bedside manner that applied equally to humans and livestock, came out and looked at the cattle and said it was bloat and that Robert had caught it early, and that with treatment and careful management it would not spread, and gave instructions and left a remedy, and there was a week of careful monitoring that came out well. And Inez, who had been the one to notice first, did not say anything about having been first to notice. Because she did not need to, and because Robert knew. The baby came on the 14th of June. Inez had known, in the final weeks of her pregnancy, that birth was likely to be the hardest physical thing she had ever done, because she was not sentimental about her body and what it was capable of, and she had listened to enough women's accounts of childbirth to have a realistic picture. What she had not fully accounted for was Robert's particular form of presence during it, which was the same presence that he had with frightened horses, quiet and steady and entirely concentrated, and which she found more useful than she had expected. Clara Drummond served as midwife, having assisted at a dozen births in the territory, and Margaret Hollies was there, and Dario waited on the porch with Scout and his hat in his hands, and the 14th of June was a long day and a longer night, and at 4 in the morning a child arrived, and he arrived loud and healthy and indignant about his arrival, and he was a boy, which neither of them had made any predictions about. Robert held his son for the first time in the gray light before dawn, with the lamp burning on the table and Inez watching him from the bed where Clara was attending to her, and the expression on his face was the same open joy she had seen when she told him she was expecting, but larger, more absolute, the kind of feeling that does not fit behind the face but shows everywhere. He looked at the baby and then at Inez, and he said, very quietly, "Thomas," which was the name they had discussed after Robert's father, and she said, "Yes." "Thomas," and they looked at each other over the head of their son in the way that people look at each other when they have made something real together. And the whole improbable sequence of events that had brought them both to this room on this morning in Cutter's Creek, Texas, seemed neither improbable nor accidental, but simply the right shape of things. In the months that followed Thomas's birth, the ranch settled into a new rhythm that had the weight and solidity of something established. Thomas was a good-natured baby, serious in the way that both his parents were serious, and he slept in the cradle that Robert had made through the winter, and he took a great interest in Scout, and Scout took a corresponding interest in him, and the dog and the infant developed a watchful mutual regard that made the adults in the household both laugh and feel that their home was complete. Dario, who had no family of his own nearby, loved Thomas with the unguarded affection that people sometimes give children when they have been careful with their feelings for a long time, and it was Dario who first made Thomas laugh, by pulling faces, and who reported this achievement to Robert with a pride that was entirely out of proportion and entirely appropriate. The ranch continued to grow and to improve. The Abilene drive became a regular decision, and the second drive, in September of the following year, went out with Dario in charge and Robert staying back, a decision that Robert made himself and that Inez understood as a statement about what was valuable and what was not. They talked about it before he made the decision at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the bedroom and the ledger open between them, and Robert said, "Dario can manage the drive. He's been doing this work longer than I have, and I'd rather be here." She looked at him across the table. "You'd rather be here," she repeated. "I missed things last year," he said. "Being gone for 6 weeks, I missed things here." He paused. "I don't want to miss things." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was an easy gesture now, the kind of ease that a year and a half of marriage produces when the marriage is honest, when two people have been willing to learn each other and be learned. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Stay," she said. He stayed. The second drive was a success. Dario came back with money and good accounts and an air of satisfaction that was entirely warranted, and Robert met him at the barn and they talked for an hour. And Inez, watching from the porch with Thomas on her hip, saw the quality of their conversation, the way two men who respect each other talk about work they have both been part of, and she thought that what the ranch had in Dario Vasquez was something that could not be valued in the ledger though it showed up there. And she thought that Robert knew this. And she was right. Margaret Hollies expanded her shop that fall, taking on a second room that had previously been a storage space belonging to the building's owner, and she hired a young woman named Sarah Vance to assist, and Inez was part of the planning conversations that made this possible, and the shop became, in the years that followed, a significant establishment in Cutter's Creek, known across the county for the quality of its work, and Inez continued to work there. Not because the ranch required the money, but because the work required her and she required the work, and Robert understood this and never suggested otherwise. The second child came in the spring of 2 years after Thomas, in April of 1885. She was a girl, which they had not predicted, and she was dark-eyed and loud and had opinions from the first day, and they named her Clara Margaret, after Clara Drummond and Margaret Hollies, both of whom were present at the birth and both of whom received this honor with different expressions. Clara with a quiet pleasure and Margaret with a sharp intake of breath and immediately wet eyes that she covered by finding something to do on the far side of the room. Thomas, who was 2 by then, looked at his sister with an evaluating expression that was unmistakably his father's and then reached out and touched her hand with one finger, and the baby grabbed his finger and held on, and Robert, standing beside the bed with his hand on Inez's shoulder, watched this and made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh of pure happiness that Inez had ever heard from him. "She's strong," Inez said. "Yes," Robert agreed. "Both of them are." "Clara Margaret Walker," Inez said, trying the name. "She sounds like someone who will argue with everyone she meets." "She sounds like someone who will win," Robert said. Inez looked up at him. That too, she said. By 1886, the Walker Ranch had a reputation in the county that was different from what it had been when Robert's father had run it, and different again from what it had been in the difficult years before the agency letter, and the screwworm and the canceled arrangement. It was known as a well-run place, a fair employer, a property that managed its water rights with the consideration that those rights affected neighboring ranches as well, and that kept its fences maintained, and its cattle counted, and its accounts in order. Some of this was Robert's steady competence. Some of it was Dario's 20 years of knowledge. And some of it, in ways that those who knew the ranch recognized clearly, was Inez Walker, who had arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1883 with a trunk and a canceled arrangement, and who had made of both of those things something that defied the calculation behind the letter. Constance Petty told the story of Inez's arrival to anyone who would listen, which was everyone in Cutter's Creek and a significant portion of the surrounding county, and the story improved slightly with each telling, as good stories do, though the essential facts of it remained intact. Mail order bride, letter of cancellation, train ticket already purchased, arrived anyway. He met her at the station. Said he had changed his mind. The version of the story that Constance told was romantic and had more drama in it than the actual event, which had been two quiet people standing on a wooden platform in the April heat and saying plain things to each other. But Inez did not correct the story, partly because she understood that stories belong to communities as well as to individuals, and partly because she thought the essential truth of it was intact even in Constance's embellished version, which was that two people had been afraid of different things and had come to the station anyway, both of them, and had said what was honest, and that honesty had been the beginning of something real. Robert, when Constance's version of the story reached him, which it did regularly and with Constance's characteristic embellishment, said to Inez in the privacy of their home, "That's not quite how it happened." "No," she agreed. "You were more matter-of-fact than she makes it sound." "I was," Inez said. "You were too. And you didn't look relieved. When I said I'd changed my mind, you didn't look relieved. You just picked up your trunk and said, 'All right, tell me.'" "I told you at the start," she said. "I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to perform feelings for the benefit of a man I hadn't met yet." "I know you weren't," he said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It was the thing about you that made me most certain." She looked at him. "That I wasn't relieved. That you were yourself," he said. "From the first moment. You were exactly yourself, and you didn't modify it for my benefit, and that was the thing that made everything else possible." Inez looked at her husband in the lamplight of their kitchen, with their two children asleep down the hall and Scout aging but still attentive on the porch, and the ranch around them in the wide Texas dark, and she thought about the woman she had been in the boarding-house room, practical and clear-eyed and unwilling to pretend, and she thought that that woman had made good choices, even when the choices were difficult, even when the ground was uncertain. "You came to the station," she said. "I came to the station," he agreed. "That was the thing that made everything else possible," she said, "from my side." He looked at her with those sage-green eyes that she knew now as well as she knew anything, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and she gave it to him, and the lamp burned between them in the clean, familiar dark. The years continued in the way that good years continue, not without difficulty, because the land and the work and the business of living on a frontier in the latter part of the 19th century did not offer exemption from difficulty, but with a quality of foundation beneath the difficulty that made it manageable, that made it, in fact, occasionally instructive in ways that were recognizable only in retrospect. There were dry years, when the cattle had to be managed differently and the water had to be conserved with a strictness that was not comfortable. And there were years of flood, once in 1887, when the creek that ran behind the cottonwoods came up over its banks in the spring rains and took out the footbridge and threatened the lower pasture, and Robert and Dario and Charlie Briggs, and Inez spent 3 days in the mud digging drainage and redirecting water and convincing cattle to higher ground. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights that took 2 years to resolve through the land office, and which Inez managed a significant portion of, including 2 formal letters to the county commissioner that were considered, by Sheriff Dale Prout, to be models of the form. There was a year when Thomas was 7 and fell from his horse and broke his left arm in 2 places, and the weeks of Doc Hendrix's attention and the bone setting and the recovery were some of the hardest weeks Inez had spent in Texas, because a child in pain is different from any other kind of difficulty, and she sat with him through nights of his discomfort and read to him all the books she had, including Jane Eyre, which Thomas listened to with the same skepticism about Mr. Rochester that his father had displayed, and which was perhaps the most specifically Thomas thing about the whole experience. Clara Margaret, at 4, had developed opinions about everything from the color of her bowl at breakfast to the proper method for feeding the chickens, and her opinions were stated with a confidence that made Margaret Hollis, her namesake, laugh with a delight that suggested she saw herself in the child, and made Inez recognize something familiar in a way that was both startling and entirely fitting. In 1888, when Thomas was 5 and Clara Margaret was 3, Dario Vasquez told Robert that he had received a letter from his brother in New Mexico, who was ill and who needed help managing his property. He told Robert this at the barn in the early morning, and Robert heard it and was quiet and then said, "How soon do you need to go?" And Dario said that he needed to go before winter. Robert nodded and said that they would manage, and he meant it, and he thanked Dario for the 23 years he had given to the Walker Ranch, and Dario said that the ranch had given him more back, and they shook hands with the grip of men who have worked beside each other through seasons and storms and cattle drives, and then Dario walked back to the bunkhouse to begin packing his things. Inez found Robert in the barn an hour later, doing nothing in particular with a piece of leather harness that did not need attending to. She sat on the fence rail and waited. "He's been here since before I was born," Robert said after a while. "I know," she said. "This ranch is half his in everything but the deed." "I know that too," she said, "and he knows it, and he's leaving anyway because his brother needs him more than this ranch does. That's the kind of man he is." Robert set the harness down. He looked at her. We can manage, she said. "Charlie Briggs is good, and we can hire another hand. We've been thinking about it anyway." "I know we have," he said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." She looked at him with a slight smile. "You could hear yourself say it." "Doesn't have the same effect," he said. Dario left in October. He left with his horse and his personal effects, and a letter from Inez to his brother's wife that was an introduction and a warm account of the man they were receiving, and he left with both children clinging to his legs at the wagon, which he resolved by promising Thomas that he would send him a horned toad from New Mexico, which he did, 6 weeks later, in a small crate with holes in the lid, and a note that said the horned toad was named after him. And Thomas was so satisfied by this that he forgave the departure entirely. The new hand they hired was a young man from San Antonio named James Reyes, who was 22 and capable, and who turned out to be as natural with cattle as anyone Robert had worked with, and who became, over the following years, a reliable part of the ranch's operation in the way that Dario had been, though different, younger, still learning the specifics of this particular land. Life in Cutter's Creek changed in the years around 1888 and after, in the ways that life in small frontier towns changed in that period. The railroad spur that had served Cutter's Creek since the late 70s was extended and improved, which brought more traffic and more commerce, and made the town incrementally less isolated. The population grew, slowly but steadily, from the 412 that the station sign had declared when Inez arrived to something closer to 600 by the end of the decade. New buildings went up. A school was established. a proper school with a hired teacher named Miss Adeline French, who was 24 and from Philadelphia, and who arrived in Cutter's Creek in 1887, with the same combination of preparedness and surprise that Inez recognized from her own arrival, and to whom Inez made a point of being the first welcoming presence, because she remembered what it was to step off a train in a strange place. Thomas started at the school in 1889 and thrived, which was no surprise to either Robert or Inez, who had been reading to him since before he could sit up on his own. Clara Margaret started 2 years later and immediately began arguing with Miss French about the proper order of the alphabet lesson, which was absolutely a surprise to no one. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the work of the day was settled, Robert and Inez still sat at the table with the lamp between them. They did not read aloud every evening anymore, because the children required evening time now, and there was always something to attend to. But on nights when the house was quiet and the work was done, and the stars were doing their enormous Texas thing outside the window, one of them would pick up a book and read, and the other would listen, and Scout would shift and sigh at their feet, and the room would be exactly the room it had been when it was new to them, and also entirely different, layered with years of the life they had made in it. Robert said one such evening, looking up from the book, "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" "Tell me," she said. "The letter I sent." "That letter to the agency." He paused. "I've thought about it a lot over the years, about how close it came to being the end of something before it started." "It didn't end it," she said. "You didn't let it end it," he said. "You could have. You could have turned that ticket in and found a way back, and you didn't." "I couldn't afford to turn the ticket in," she said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and she thought he knew both things. "You could have stayed in St. Louis," he said. "I could have," she agreed, "and you could have stayed away from the station." "I couldn't," he said, with a conviction that was simple and absolute. She looked at him. "No," she said. "Neither could I, really." The lamp burned between them, and the coyotes called out in the dark beyond the cottonwoods, and the night settled its weight on the world in the way that night in Texas settles, fully and without apology. And Robert Walker looked at his wife across the table with the sage-green eyes that she had been reading for 7 years, and she looked back at him with the dark eyes that he had been reading for the same 7 years. And neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things do not need to be said. What had been built between them in those years was not the thing that either of them had submitted to the Hargrove matrimonial agency for. It was not the practical arrangement, the mutual convenience, the contract of cohabitation that the agency's literature described with its careful and unromantic language of compatibility and practical union. What had been built was something that had grown from honesty and work and the willingness to be known, from reading aloud in the evenings, and fighting a grass fire in the dark, and writing letters about things that mattered, and building a cradle through a winter, and caring for each other's fears as well as each other's strengths. It was a thing of substance, built on the foundation of two people who had looked at each other clearly from the first moment and not flinched from what they saw. Thomas turned 12 in the summer of 1895, and on his birthday, Robert took him out to the south pasture and let him work the cattle with the grown men for the first time, a full day's work. And Thomas came home sunburned and bone-tired and looked at his father at the dinner table with an expression of exhausted pride that Robert returned with a quiet nod. And Inez watched this exchange across the table and felt the full weight of how much love could be communicated in a nod, and thought about a man she had seen on a train station platform with his elbows on his knees and his hat pulled low, and about how much had come from going to that man and saying his name. Clara Margaret, 10 that spring, sat beside her brother at dinner and listened to his account of the day with an expression of determined assessment, and when Thomas paused she said, "I'm going next summer," and Robert looked at her and said, "Yes, you are," and her face went briefly, luminously satisfied in the way that her mother's face sometimes went when something happened exactly as it should. In the evenings of that summer, Inez would sometimes sit on the front porch in the hour before dark, with the sky turning orange and purple and the air cooling from the day's heat, and the sound of the ranch around her, horses moving in the corral and the cattle distant and the wind in the cottonwoods, and she would think about the shape of her life with the clear-eyed pleasure of someone who has made good choices and knows it. She was 38 years old. She had come to Texas at 26 with a trunk and a canceled arrangement, and a practical nature that had served her well in every circumstance she had been placed in. She had a husband she trusted and respected and loved in the deep-rooted way that the word love is most accurately used, which is not about the beginning of a thing, but about what it becomes when it has been through seasons and difficulty and been found to hold. She had 2 children who were remarkable and who would be capable, and who would go out into the world with something in them that had been shaped here, on this land, in this family. She had friends in this town and work that was her own, and a garden that produced with satisfying abundance, and a life that was not simple but was complete. Robert would come out to the porch after his evening check of the animals. He would sit beside her and she would feel the warmth of him beside her, and they would watch the last of the day together in a comfortable silence that was nothing like the silence of strangers, but was the silence of 2 people who have become, over years, deeply at home in each other's company. One evening he came out and sat beside her and looked at the sky for a while and then said, Pete Alcott was asking about Thomas, whether he'd be interested in working the Alcott property this summer. What did you tell him? Inez said, I told him I'd ask Thomas, Robert said, and you. It would be good for him, she said, working a different property, seeing how someone else does it. Yes, Robert said, I thought so too. Ask him, she said. Thomas went to the Alcott property for 6 weeks that summer and came back with new knowledge and a friendship with Pete Alcott's son Daniel that would last, as it turned out, for the rest of their lives. Clara Margaret, who had been promised her own turn in the South pasture, delivered on the promise the following summer and surprised exactly no one by having a natural facility with cattle that made James Reyes shake his head in a way that was purely admiring and say to Robert, She is going to be a better rancher than either of us. And Robert had told this to Inez at the dinner table, and Inez had looked at her daughter and said, Yes, with a satisfaction that was complete. The world was changing in the 1890s, as it changed in all decades, but the quality of the change in these years was visible in a way that made itself felt even in a small town in West Texas. The frontier was drawing in at its edges. The wild quality of the land that Inez had first seen from the train window in 1883, the quality of untouched and enormous possibility, was not gone but was bounded differently now, ordered more fully, claimed and named. The cattle drives that had been the backbone of the ranching economy for 30 years were changing with the railroads and the fencing of the open range, and the decisions that Robert and Inez made about the ranch were made in the context of a different landscape than the one they had started in. They made the decisions together, as they had made all the decisions since the evening at the kitchen table, with the map spread out and Dario standing at the door. They were partners in this enterprise in the full sense of the word, and it was a partnership of equals, which was not the usual arrangement in a marriage in this time and place, but which was the arrangement that had grown from the specific and particular nature of the 2 people in it, and which worked, and which they were too practical to change even if either of them had wanted to. The 5th decade of the 19th century turned to the last, and then the last turned, and the night of December 31st, 1899, found Cutter's Creek population approximately 800 and something, and found Robert and Inez Walker on their porch in the cold night air with blankets over their shoulders and their children, Thomas 17 and Clara Margaret 15, standing nearby talking about whether the new century would change things significantly. Which Thomas thought it would, and Clara Margaret thought it would differently than Thomas thought. And Robert said very little, and Inez listened to her children argue with each other, with the particular pleasure of a person watching. something good that they have helped to make. The night was cold and clear, and the stars above Texas were the same stars that had been above it on every night of the previous 17 years, the same stars she had looked at from the train window in the spring of 1883 and understood were different from the stars she had known before, larger and more numerous and more willing to state their presence. Robert put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder. The children continued to argue about the century. Scout was gone 3 years now, having lived to the extraordinary age of 14, and his absence was a particular kind of gentle sadness that neither of them spoke of because they did not need to. 17 years, Robert said quietly, not to anyone in particular. 17 years, Inez agreed. I came to the station, he said. You came to the station, she said, and I had already packed. He held her more closely in the cold night, and the last seconds of the last century moved through them like a river that does not stop at any border, and the new century arrived without fanfare or lightning, just one moment becoming the next, which is how all important things arrive when they are real. Thomas said, "It's midnight," and Clara Margaret said, "I know," and Robert pressed his lips to the top of Inez's head, and Inez thought about all the things that had led to this porch, this cold, clear night, this arm around her shoulder, this life. A $5 bill on a table in St. Louis, a trunk with her name on the tag, a ticket that was already bought, a platform in Cutter's Creek. A man with his hat pulled low and his elbows on his knees who stood up when she came toward him and looked at her with sage-green eyes and said that he had changed his mind. She had been right to come. She had known it since the station and had confirmed it every day since in the clear-eyed way that she confirmed everything, by looking at it honestly and finding it true. The new century lay ahead of them like that first stretch of Texas that she had seen from the train window, flat and enormous and full of a particular quality of light that was its own, and she was not afraid of it at all. "Happy New Year," she said to Robert, to her children, to the night. "Happy New Year," said Robert. And above them the stars continued their indifferent burning, and below them the land held steady, and the Walker Ranch sat in the dark in the way that all things sit in the dark when they have been built to last, present and patient and ready for morning.